Hey guys, tonight we set out on a quiet journey into the past, to the world of the geisha, one of Japan's most misunderstood and mythologized roles in history. So before you settle into bed, maybe dim the lights or let a fan hum softly in the background. Let the world slow down as we step back in time, together. Imagine being born into the heart of Edo, that old name for what would become Tokyo, during the days when the streets were alive with merchants, monks, and gossiping neighbors who always claimed to have descended from samurai. You're a young girl, barely old enough to count your own fingers without help, but already the shape of your life is being traced by hands not your own. You still chase butterflies. You still think beetles are little armored soldiers. But the adults in your life, your parents, your elders, have decided something in whispers and nods. They've chosen a path for you. Not the path of a wife tending fields or the solitude of temple walls, but something else entirely. You will become a geisha. Not today and not tomorrow, but soon. For now, you wear your finest kimono, even though it scratches your skin and squeezes your chest too tight. Your parents guide you through narrow streets until you arrive at a building that looks like a monastery dressed for a wedding. This is the Okiya, the geisha house. And once you step inside, everything changes. A stern woman opens the sliding door. Her eyes scan you with the precision of a ledger, and she doesn't smile. Her name is Okasan, but she's not your mother, not in the way you understand. Your parents bow, speak softly, then leave. No tears, no drama. Just the quiet closing of a chapter. You've not been adopted. You've been transferred. You're no longer a daughter. You're now property. Your training begins not with dancing or music, but with a rag and a bucket. You're a shikomi now, a child who cleans, watches, and stays quiet. You scrub floors that seem to stretch endlessly, prepare baths you won't step into, and learn how to disappear into silence. Your bed is a mat in the hallway, and you eat last if there's food left. Around you move the geisha, women who glide like spirits, their hair lacquered into stillness, their expressions unreadable. You watch them, mesmerized, trying not to blink too loudly. You're told not to speak unless spoken to, and even then, your tone must be as soft as tatami mats under bare feet. It is a lesson in restraint. Even blinking feels like a mistake if done at the wrong moment. There is no classroom, no chalkboard. Your education is entirely observation. You learn to mimic without being taught, to fold cloth just so by watching hands move faster than your eyes can follow. You bow until your back aches and repeat small tasks until your mistakes vanish. You pour tea 100 times and still spill a little. And you do it again. Every day begins before the sun and ends only when your arms ache and your knees threaten to give out. You fetch sandals, carry firewood, and are scolded for walking too loudly. You learn that silence is not emptiness. It is discipline. It is the unspoken currency of survival in the Okiya. The older girls might be gentle, or they might not. Some smile as they pass you by, others step around you as if you were a stool. But you keep your head down, because even the most graceful among them once scrubbed these floors and cried into their sleeves. No one is born a geisha. Everyone begins here, on their knees, and so you endure. Because deep down, something begins to change. You notice how the fan opens just before laughter. You see how they turn, not in steps, but in rhythm. You begin to understand that this life isn't about decoration. It's about control. A mastery not of others, but of yourself. Of how you move, how you hold your breath, how you disappear and reappear with purpose. You're still a shadow. But one day, if you last long enough, you'll become the one others look at and wonder how you float so effortlessly across a room. But for now, your only job is to listen, to scrub, and to wait. Your feet are tired, your fingers calloused, but time moves forward. Eventually, The next chapter arrives, not in a moment of celebration, but in a quiet shift of responsibility. You've proven you can endure silence. Now, you're told it's time to learn how to sit. Not walk, not speak, not even dance. Just sit. This, you discover, is posture training, a ritual as ancient as any ceremony in Japan. You're taught to fold your legs beneath you in seiza, that dignified kneeling position with your back upright, hands resting like still water in your lap. At first, it feels innocent, but then your legs go numb, then painful, then disappear entirely as your lower half becomes a whisper of suffering, and you're still not allowed to move. In this world, pain is an invisible thread in the fabric of elegance. You are taught to wear it with grace. Shifting your weight is weakness. Sighing is indulgent. You learn to endure without expression until stillness itself becomes a skill. And then come the bows, not one, not two, but dozens of variations, each with its own context, its own meaning. A bow to greet, a bow to show thanks, one to apologize, another to plead without words. You're taught the correct angle of your neck, the length of pause before rising, and how your fingers must rest like flower petals on the floor. Get it wrong, and you'll be corrected. Not with shouts, but with a silence so heavy it flattens your spirit. The tea ceremony begins to shape your understanding of performance. You're not just sitting anymore. You're becoming part of a ritual. Each gesture is deliberate. You learn to lift the teacup like it holds the weight of generations, to move with the gentleness of rain. And if you cough or shift or sneeze, you're reminded, kindly but firmly, that you've just broken the spell. Somewhere along the way, you begin to change. Not overnight, not suddenly, but gradually, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. Your spine straightens before you're even told. Your fingers learn their positions. You start to bow at the right moments without thinking. The house begins to notice. You're no longer just a girl who mops floors. You're becoming something else. Not quite visible. Not quite invisible. Something in between. And then, after years of serving in silence, your name is called. You're told you're ready. Not for freedom, not for comfort, but for the next step in your transformation. You're to become a maiko, an apprentice geisha. The announcement feels surreal. There is no parade, no celebration. Just a quiet acknowledgement. You are now expected to carry the weight of beauty on your shoulders. The first weight is your hair. Stylists arrive with wax, pins, and techniques passed down through generations. They twist and pull, sculpt and layer, until your head becomes a living statue. Your hairstyle is not just decoration, it is identity, status, and symbolism all at once. The final product is elegant, but sleep is no longer an option. From now on, you rest your head on a wooden neck block, the takamakura, a small, torturous pillow that preserves your hair at the cost of comfort. Then comes the kimono. Not a soft robe, but a fortress of fabric. It is embroidered, intricate, heavy. The sleeves hang like banners, and the obi, tied elaborately at your back, presses against your spine like a bundle of stone. You need 2, sometimes 3 people just to get dressed. By the time you're done, your breath is shallow and your arms ache, but you must smile and glide as if none of that matters. And the ornaments, kanzashi, those shimmering hair pieces, are not just pretty. They are sharp enough to draw blood and specific enough to reveal your rank, the season, and your stage in training. One wrong flower, one misplaced pin, and everyone in the room knows that you've made a mistake. As a maiko, you are still learning, but now the city watches. When you walk, people turn to look. Not because you are famous, but because you are becoming. You are a work in progress, a living symbol of tradition in motion. And the world sees that. Your debut ceremony arrives with formality and pressure. You perform, you bow, You serve tea with trembling hands. Your every movement is watched, evaluated, remembered. And when it is over, you haven't just survived, you've been accepted. But you also learn something else, something quieter. That your transformation is not about vanishing into beauty, but about mastering the art of presence, of being noticed without demanding attention, of captivating a room without raising your voice. You are no longer just a servant. You are now a Maiko, part performer, part apprentice, and still entirely in training. Your face, from this point forward, is no longer just yours. It is a canvas painted by centuries of ritual. Each morning begins with transformation, not of spirit, but of skin. The rice powder comes first, cold and thick, pressed into every pore until your own features seem to vanish beneath its ghostly mask. You are taught not to rush, not to miss a single curve or line. The powder covers not just your face, but your neck, your chest, any skin that might be seen. It is chalky, dry, and it clings like memory. Once your skin is bleached to perfection, you erase your eyebrows. Not with a razor, but with layers of white that smooth them away. In their place, thin, dark arches are painted, shaped to suggest elegance, mystery, perhaps even wisdom. Your eyes are then touched with red and black pigment, applied with tiny brushes made for rice paper and trembling hands. The effect is mesmerizing, a gaze that hovers somewhere between human and doll. And then your lips. Only one at first. The lower lip is painted red in a shape so precise it looks like it was whispered into existence. Why only one? You're told it's about modesty, youth, a mark that says, I am still learning. You eat carefully. You drink in tiny sips, because any smudge ruins the illusion, and illusion is now your entire profession. The final result is stunning and slightly surreal. You look in the mirror and see not yourself, but something older, sharper, more permanent. A mask, yes, but also a weapon. This is not makeup for beauty. This is war paint for the theater of power. But your true tools are not your lips or eyes or hair. They are sound and silence. You begin learning the shamisen, a 3-stringed instrument that looks like it was carved from moonlight and discipline. You hold it awkwardly at first, plucking and strumming until the noise becomes something like a melody. Your fingers blister. Your teacher says nothing. You keep playing. Slowly, the noise becomes music. The music becomes rhythm. The rhythm becomes language. And then comes the more delicate performance, conversation. You're trained not just to speak, but to navigate, to lead a man through a dialogue like a winding garden path. You don't flatter. Flattery is transparent. You intrigue. You laugh softly at the right moment, redirect clumsy comments with elegance, and never, ever let silence become awkward. You learn how to be present without overwhelming, how to be charming without being available. If a client hints at wealth, you smile and ask about poetry. If he leans in too far, you offer him more tea and speak of moonlight. You are not a flirt, you are a mirror. Whatever he wants to see, you reflect it back to him. Gently, politely, and with just enough distance that he never quite feels in control. And you memorize poems, hundreds of them. Lines about rivers and plum blossoms. About lovers who wait through winter and never quite meet again in spring. You recite them while pouring sake, your voice like silk slipping across a stone floor. You don't just entertain, you curate emotion. You manage the atmosphere of a room. At some point, you realize you're getting good at it. You can enter a room and know within seconds who is anxious, who is drunk, who is looking for a reason to speak, and who just wants to be looked at. You orchestrate conversation like a musician conducts a symphony. You read moods faster than names. You're no longer a girl who scrubs floors. You are a shadow that shines. And just when you think you found balance in the dance, you learn about the Dana. The word means patron, but it carries weight. A Dana is a man who sponsors your career, who pays for your kimono, your hair ornaments, your future. In exchange, he expects something. What exactly? No one says out loud. Sometimes it's simply your presence at dinners. Sometimes it's more. The boundary is vague. The pressure immense. You do not choose your Dana, the house chooses. They weigh wealth, power, reputation. You weigh silence. You are told to smile, to charm, to listen, and never to appear unwilling, but also never to appear too willing. You walk a narrow bridge of expectations above a sea of unspoken contracts. Some Dana are kind, some are not. All of them hold the keys to your future. You learn, again, how to survive. You survive with grace, with charm, with silence. You survive with sentences that glide over propositions and land gently on topics like seasons or tea leaves. You become a master of deflection. You say, "Oh, what a shame, I'm terribly busy that day," even when no date was suggested. You smile and say, "Ah, you must be very popular." When someone leans too close, you redirect without rejecting. You refuse without refusing. This becomes your secret strength, saying no without ever letting the word leave your lips. Because in your world, no one wants bluntness. No one pays a geisha to be real. They pay for illusion, for poetry, for the comforting fog of tradition wrapped in silk. You offer all of that and keep yourself safe behind the curtain. You are no longer just performing, you are protecting yourself, your future, your name. And so you smile, bow, and say, "Such an interesting thought." And just like that, the moment passes. The okiya seems peaceful from the outside. Sliding doors, soft lamps, quiet music drifting through paper walls. But inside, it is something else entirely. Not chaos, not violence, but strategy, precision, a war fought with fans and compliments. There are no swords here, only glances, no declarations of battle, just a sudden shift in who gets to pour the tea or perform the dance. This is not a house of sisters. It is a house of survivors. Each geisha, each maiko, each shikomi carries the same burden of tradition, but they are not all kind. Sometimes the sabotage is obvious. Your sandals disappear before performance. Your teacup gets swapped. A client is told, ever so gently, that your giggle was a little too loud, a little too familiar. Sometimes the sabotage is poetic. A single syllable added to your haiku. A rumor that travels faster than sound, whispered in a corridor, wrapped in laughter. And always, it's done with a smile. Because here, losing your temper is not just foolish, it's fatal. Rage is inelegant. Tears are wasteful. Revenge is served folded into pleasantries. You learn to fight in silence, to nod in thanks when someone insults you, to bow just a little lower when you've been undercut, to say, "How beautiful your new obi is. I would never be bold enough to wear something so daring," and let the message settle like dust. Some girls rise through talent, others through alliances, a few through cunning, but all of them are watching, measuring, calculating who gets the best clients, who walks in the room first, who is whispered about, and who is ignored. Popularity isn't declared, it's felt in the way people move when you enter, in how long the laughter lasts after your joke, in whether your shamisen solo is suddenly given to someone else. You try to rise above it. You tell yourself you're here for the art. But even art has politics. Eventually, you learn how to survive it. You become a strategist. You give compliments that sound like blessings, but sting like bees. You remember who borrowed your obi, who forgot to return your comb. You learn how to win arguments by never speaking of them. You keep your cosmetics close, your secrets closer, and you never, ever turn your back on a mirror. Time passes, and you grow. You outlast others. Your posture becomes instinct. Your tea never spills. Your voice is soft but steady. You've learned how to walk into a room and make silence feel like presence. You've become someone the younger girls look up to, even when they're secretly hoping you'll trip on your sleeves. And then, one morning, without ceremony, without announcement, the change happens. You are no longer a Maiko. You are now a geisha. The transformation is not marked by drums or festivals. It is not celebrated with fireworks. It arrives quietly, like mist. You wake, and you are different, not because of what you wear, but because of what you no longer need to prove. Your kimono changes. Gone are the vivid, oversized sleeves, the floral bursts of youthful ambition. Your attire becomes elegant, subtle, controlled, like you. The hair that once required nightly torture is now a wig, heavier perhaps, but mercifully detached. You sleep again, properly, though never deeply. But the greatest difference isn't in what you wear. It's in how you are treated. You no longer follow, you lead, you no longer watch, you host, you no longer hope to be heard. People listen when you speak, even if you rarely do. Your performances are now solo. Your shamisen solos are longer, your dances more refined. You no longer need to recite poetry for approval. You recite it because it's part of the air you now breathe. And with this status comes burden. You're expected to mentor the younger girls, to help shape them as you were shaped. You see yourself in their nervous bows, in their trembling hands as they paint their first red lip. And you remember the weight of silence, the ache of posture, the dance of words. You teach them not with long speeches, but with a look, a gesture, a correction made so gently it's barely noticed. But even as you rise, you know the journey is not toward ease, it is toward mastery. You carry the past now, the house's memory, the reputation of every performance. You have become what the Okia builds, a living sculpture of history, of expectation, of womanhood shaped by rules older than most buildings in the city. And strangely, your knees still hurt, as if to remind you this elegance was earned. You've spent years wrapped in layers of silk, mastering restraint, performing with precision. You've become a geisha, no longer an apprentice, no longer learning by watching. Now others watch you. But unlike most paths, this elevation is not a beginning. It's a softening, a quiet descent into something slower, subtler, but just as demanding. You no longer dance to be noticed. You dance to remind. You are no longer expected to astonish. You are expected to endure. The nights blur together. Dinners, performances, conversations so polished they gleam. Clients come and go. Some return. Many do not. You smile at all of them, not because you're pleased, but because it is what is expected. Your value lies not in novelty now, but in constancy. The elegance you've spent years crafting is no longer a performance. It is your skin. But the world shifts. The bright-eyed girls who once bowed too low now wear their own hair ornaments with pride. They step into rooms you used to own. They speak a little louder, laugh a little longer. And though you still command respect, you begin to sense the tempo changing. Not suddenly, slowly, like a lantern burning lower. No one tells you when it happens. There is no announcement. You simply begin to appear in fewer appointments. Your name on the schedule becomes less frequent. You notice the tea is being poured by someone else. You've not been dismissed. You've become background. This is the unspoken chapter in every geisha's life. Retirement doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives like dust, settling, then staying. Some geisha fade quietly. They leave the house one morning and never return, taking their fans and their silence with them. Others remain, slowly folding themselves into the architecture. Not forgotten, not gone, just part of the walls. If you're lucky or careful, you evolve. Some women become teachers. You correct a bow angle with a glance, adjust a sleeve mid-performance, and say little else. You carry generations in your posture. You know when to let a mistake pass and when to preserve the legacy by stopping everything with a single raised eyebrow. Others become house mothers. You become the Okaasen, the very woman who once examined your bow with hawk-like intensity, who seemed carved from salt and wisdom. Now you are her. You inspect new recruits with eyes that have seen everything. You no longer perform, but you orchestrate. You know which girl is ready, which one needs more time, which one is buckling under the pressure but too proud to cry. You remember, you were her. Some marry, quietly, discreetly, sometimes to a former patron, sometimes to a man who has the good sense not to ask what the wigs cost. You trade one performance for another. You smile at dinners. You raise children with the same grace you once poured tea. You fold into domesticity, and though you lose the spotlight, you carry its glow with you, and some simply continue. You perform less often, but when you do, your presence shifts the atmosphere of the room. You say less, but what you say matters more. A single nod, a single pause, can carry the weight of decades. You walk slower now, but your steps still sing of control. The fan still opens with the same quiet precision. The silence you've mastered still bends to your will. You're not a ghost, you are legacy. The younger girls whisper about you, never in front of you. They mimic your movements. They study your gestures like scripture. You see yourself in them. Not the pain, not the hardship, but the transformation, the way they bow just slightly deeper in your presence. Not out of fear, out of reverence. There is no monument for you, no carved name on a stone, no biography in a bookshop, but that was never the goal. You were not meant to be remembered loudly. You were meant to be unforgettable in silence. So when you are gone, someone else will pour tea the way you did. Someone else will smile with half a lip and say just enough. Someone will walk across a room without rustling a single thread of silk. And when they do, they will not know your name. But they will carry your legacy in their hands, their steps, their breath. And you will still be there. Not as a shadow, but as the shape that silence leaves behind. Long before vows were whispered beneath cathedrals or rings exchanged beneath chandeliers, marriage began as something far less poetic, etched not in ink, but in clay, and carried not on the breath of lovers, but on the hands of scribes. In the fertile plains of ancient Sumer, where the Tigris and Euphrates danced across the earth, and where writing itself was barely born, marriage was less a promise and more a ledger. It was an agreement, pressed into wet clay tablets with a stylus. Its grooves hardened in the sun alongside laws, debts, and inventories. Here, affection was optional. Contracts were not. To marry meant to merge assets, to secure alliances, to define property, especially human property. A woman brought a dowry, cattle, textiles, perhaps a servant or two. The man, in turn, might offer a bride price, less an offering of love, more a security deposit. If the union failed, the terms were clear. The contract outlined what was owed, what would be returned, what would be lost. Marriage, to the Sumerians, was not a soft union of hearts. It was the cement of civilization. Through it, families preserved land, controlled inheritance, and ensured the clean transmission of names and bloodlines. Children weren't blessings. They were successors. And love, if it bloomed at all, was a pleasant accident. There were expectations, of course. Women were to be faithful, fertile, respectable. Men, for their part, were to provide and protect, at least enough to avoid disgrace during public rituals. Infidelity on the wife's part was punished harshly, even lethally. Divorce, while allowed, required justification. We drifted apart was not a valid plea. The wedding itself was a modest affair. No flowing gowns, no whispered vows. Likely just a shared meal, a symbolic gesture, and the quiet filing of the marriage tablet, an ancient receipt stored alongside other civic paperwork. What mattered wasn't the celebration, it was recognition. The community had to know. The contract had to exist. In Sumer, love did not conquer all. Order did. The marriage tablet was not a love letter. It was a transaction, and in that transaction, society found structure. The union of two people, whether joyful or strained, was always a building block, a way to secure land, loyalty, and legacy. Marriage wasn't the beginning of a romantic tale. It was the foundation of civilization itself. And so, thousands of years ago, beneath the blazing sun of Mesopotamia, amid barley fields and temple towers, a woman and man stood side by side, not to declare devotion, but to formalize obligation. The gods watched, the scribes recorded, and the idea of marriage, practical, permanent, and profoundly human, was born. In ancient Egypt, to marry was not merely to bind two people, it was to echo the heavens. The gods themselves were married. Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb. Even the primal forces of chaos were paired, as if the universe itself required companionship to stay balanced. And so, when two people came together in Egypt, it wasn't just a social arrangement, it was a ritual act, a mirror held up to the divine. But don't mistake this for romance in the modern sense. Egyptian marriage had little need for grand proposals or sweeping declarations. It was practical, it was sacred, and it was expected. A man was to marry young, ideally before he could squander his strength or wealth. A woman, often still in her early teens, was married not to chase love, but to build a household, to weave lineage into the rhythm of life along the Nile. The wedding itself was simple. No processions, no priests, no orchestrated spectacle. The ceremony was the act of moving in together, the start of shared bread and shared space. Marriage began when two lives were folded into one domestic rhythm, when her cooking pot sat beside his, and her sandals waited near his door. Yet within this simplicity was tenderness. In love poetry etched on papyrus or painted on tomb walls, we find yearning not for property, but for presence. "She has stolen my heart with her hair," one poem murmurs. Another says, "I cannot sleep for thinking of her." In these verses, love becomes something soft and earthy, a flutter in the chest, a sigh beneath moonlight. Not essential, perhaps, but real. Egyptian women, remarkably, held legal power. They could own land, inherit wealth, sue their husbands, even initiate divorce. A woman, queen or not, had standing in her home and in court, and if her husband failed to provide bread, beer, or the oil she was due, she could walk away with her dignity and a fair portion of his grain. Among royalty, the boundaries were different. Pharaohs often married their sisters, not from affection, but from theology. Just as Isis wed Osiris, the royal family mirrored divine incest to preserve bloodlines thought to be God-touched. These unions were not romantic. They were symbolic. Sacred genes, protected at the cost of genetic risk. But the core of Egyptian marriage remained the home, not the throne. Children were the heart of the union. Not affection, not chemistry. Offspring ensured that names were remembered, that tombs were visited, and that offerings were made for generations to come. A childless home was a quiet tragedy, less for the parents and more for the ancestors waiting for someone to keep their memory alive. If a wife could not conceive, the solution was not despair, but addition. Another wife. A concubine. A widening of the household to preserve the lineage. Not betrayal, not abandonment, just practical continuity. Emotion was secondary. Lineage was eternal, and when the marriage failed, divorce was not scandalous, it was accepted, even routine. The tablet would be updated. property divided, children arranged, lives separated not in anger but in understanding. It was, after all, a union of practicality. Still, something about Egyptian marriage lingers, not in the structure, but in the glimpses. The love poems, the statues of couples holding hands for eternity, the quiet inscriptions where a husband says, "She was the woman of my heart," and means it. Because even in a world governed by grain, ritual, and divine example, the human heart still found its own rhythm, soft, fleeting, and deeply felt. If the Sumerians made marriage into a ledger, and the Egyptians made it a shadow of the divine, the Spartans turned it into a form of warfare. In Sparta, everything served the state, every citizen, every child, every union. Marriage was not a celebration of love, it was a tactical decision in the machinery of survival. Romance was irrelevant. What mattered was strength, health, endurance, the making of children who could hold a shield and not flinch when the sky turned red. For Spartan boys, childhood ended at 7. Taken from their families, they were cast into the agage, a brutal training regime where softness was not corrected. It was erased. They learned to fight, to starve, to suffer in silence. They were taught that their lives belonged not to themselves, but to Sparta. Meanwhile, the girls, unlike most women of the ancient world, were trained too. Wrestling, javelin throwing, running. Not because they would fight, but because they would give birth to warriors. And a weak woman in the eyes of the Spartans could never birth a strong child. Marriage was simply the next phase of the state's grand experiment in power. Spartan men did not marry at 20. They waited until 30. Until their muscles were hardened, their loyalty tested, their wills bent into weapons. And when the time came to marry, the ritual was no less strange than the society that created it. The bride's head was shaved, her body dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. She was made to look like the men the groom had spent his life training beside. Then, alone in a darkened room, she waited. The groom would sneak in by night, consummate the union in silence, and then vanish before dawn, returning to the all-male barracks he shared with his comrades. Even after marriage, the couple did not live together. The man remained with his fellow soldiers, the woman with her family. Their meetings were secret, infrequent, arranged like strategic rendezvous between opposing armies. The state believed that this kept passion alive. That distance fed desire, that routine dulled purpose. Love, it seemed, was dangerous to loyalty. But Spartan women, though hidden from romance, were not hidden from power. They owned land, managed estates, controlled wealth, and they spoke their minds. With sharp tongues and sharper wit, they reminded their husbands what they were fighting for. One Spartan mother is said to have told her son, "Return with your shield or on it." A simple message. Do not come home defeated. These women weren't demure. They were steel, wrapped in linen. They raised sons to kill or die. They bore daughters who would one day do the same. And while other cultures buried their women beneath layers of law and obedience, Sparta made them central, because they understood that the strongest warriors begin in the womb. Marriage, in this city of stone and silence, was not a personal joy. It was a civic function, a transaction of bodies for the purpose of national endurance. There were no wedding feasts, no sacred oaths to the gods of love, only the expectation of loyalty, and the hope that a child would be born who could hold a spear with pride. In the end, a Spartan marriage was like the land it came from, hard, functional, unforgiving. But within it burned something potent, the belief that strength begins not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, hidden places where two lives are bound for a cause greater than either one. In ancient India, marriage was not just a union, it was a rite of passage, a spiritual obligation woven into the fabric of the cosmos. The Vedic tradition, which shaped the moral and social structure of the time, held that life consisted of sacred stages, each guided by Dharma, the universal law of order and balance. Marriage was one of these key turning points. To marry was not merely to begin a household, but to align oneself with the deeper currents of the universe. Here, the couple did not simply promise fidelity. They invoked the gods, the ancestors, and the elements. They stood before a sacred fire, Agni, the divine witness, and walked 7 measured steps, the Sapta Paudi, each one sealed with a vow. To nourish each other, to grow in strength, to walk in harmony, to raise children, to share joys and losses. To remain companions for life. No written contracts, no sealed ledgers. The promises were spoken aloud, not only to one another, but to the universe itself. Words, once offered to fire, could not be taken back. And yet the arrangement of these unions was anything but whimsical. Marriage was a bond not just between 2 souls, but between families, castes, and generations. Matches were arranged with care. Horoscopes were studied, stars examined. The alignment of planets could affirm or deny a union. Astrology wasn't superstition, it was structure. Cosmic timing had to meet earthly responsibility. Love might bloom later, or not at all. The bride, known as Dharmapatni, the partner in righteousness, was expected to uphold the home's moral center. She tended not just the hearth, but the ancestral line. She was expected to offer prayers, manage the household, and raise children in accordance with sacred teachings. Her role, though often confined to the domestic realm, was considered spiritually crucial. The husband's duties were clear: protect, provide, and perform rituals. But his authority came with responsibility. The couple walked as 2 halves of one sacred journey. And though patriarchy shaped their roles, the woman was not viewed as secondary. She was essential. No ritual was complete without her. No household pure without her. Monogamy was the ideal, though among kings and nobles, polygamy existed. Less out of desire and more out of duty, inheritance, and political necessity. But even here, hierarchy and balance were enforced through custom. When a woman lost her husband, the world narrowed. Widows were expected to live simply, to turn inward. The later practice of sati, where a widow would immolate herself on her husband's pyre, did exist, but rarely, and it was never part of Vedic law. It emerged later, and mostly on the periphery of culture, distorted by time and politics. In earlier traditions, widows were mourners, not sacrifices. What defined marriage in ancient India wasn't property or power. It was dharma, the sense that the bond was part of a greater balance, the idea that 2 lives, joined in ceremony, could ripple outward, to ancestors, to children, to gods. There were no lavish cakes, no orchestras, no rings, just fire. Sandalwood. Mantras whispered beneath stars that had watched over generations. A union, not for pleasure alone, but for eternity. In ancient China, a marriage was never truly between 2 people. It was between 2 lineages, 2 ancestral altars, 2 family names extending into the future and into the past. Love had little to do with it. In a society built on Confucian ideals and the ever-present weight of filial piety, marriage was an obligation. It ensured continuity. It honored ancestors. It preserved the family line. Without it, harmony was disrupted, not only in the household, but in the cosmic balance. To marry was not a choice. It was a responsibility to your ancestors. A son who remained unmarried was considered incomplete, not simply because he lacked a companion, but because he failed to produce descendants who could continue the family's spiritual duties. In China, the dead lived on through ritual. They had to be fed, remembered, honored with incense and offerings. Without children, specifically sons, the ancestral rites ceased, and with that silence came shame. So marriages were arranged not through whispered affections or chance encounters, but through negotiation. Families consulted matchmakers, May Ren, women or men who specialized in forging alliances. They studied family records, examined birth charts, calculated the celestial compatibility of each pair. The stars had to align. Bloodlines had to match. It wasn't about feelings. It was about timing, reputation, and legacy. The process was known as the 6 rites: proposal, name exchange, divination, betrothal gifts, setting the date, and the wedding itself. Each step required ceremony. Each gesture was rich with meaning. Months, even years, could pass between the first inquiry and the final union. On the wedding day, the bride wore red, not white. Red for joy, prosperity, protection. Her face was veiled, her carriage elaborately decorated. She was carried to her new home in a jiaozi, a bridal sedan chair, hidden from view, a precious offering from one house to another. When she arrived, she dismounted carefully. There was no kiss, no exchange of rings. Instead, she and her husband bowed 3 times, first to heaven and earth, then to the ancestors, then to each other. These were the true vows, not of love, but of hierarchy. The message was clear. The cosmos came first, then the family, then the self. Afterward, she entered the household. Not as an equal, but as a daughter-in-law. Her loyalty transferred from her birth family to her husband's clan. She was expected to obey his parents as her own, to bear sons, to manage the domestic space, and above all, to uphold the reputation of the family into which she had married. There was no room for disobedience. Her virtue was her value. Some women rose in influence, especially if they bore sons. A mother-in-law, once a bride herself, could command great authority over the home. Others remained quiet, obedient, invisible. But always, their role was defined within the strict hierarchy of the household. Divorce existed, but only as a shadow. A man could dismiss his wife for reasons deemed dishonorable: barrenness, disobedience, jealousy, theft. A woman, however, had almost no recourse. Her vows were binding, her exit nearly impossible. Yet not all unions were without affection. Poetry survived, love stories were whispered, but these were exceptions, not the rule. The structure remained firm. Marriage was a duty to the living and the dead, and love, if it appeared, was a bonus, not a requirement.
In ancient China, the ceremony was not a celebration. It was a submission, a formal acceptance of your place in a lineage stretching backward through incense and silence, and forward through the cries of yet unborn children. To marry was not to begin a life together. It was to step into a life already written. In ancient Japan, marriage was not bound tightly by law or dictated from temples. It was a fluid act, shaped by seasons, customs, and the whispering presence of the kami, the divine spirit said to dwell in trees, rivers, wind, and memory. Here, love was not commanded, nor was it irrelevant. It simply lived alongside other needs: the continuation of family, the keeping of social peace, the honoring of spirits. Marriage, like much in early Japanese life, was guided not by legal contract or religious obligation, but by a deep cultural sense of balance. Rooted in Shinto, the native spiritual path of Japan, marriage was viewed through the lens of purity, ancestry, and connection to the natural world. A union between two people was also a union of households, of ancestors, of rituals. It was not about possession. It was about placement, a new thread carefully woven into an already existing tapestry. In its earliest form, the marital custom of mukuiri prevailed. The groom would enter the bride's family home, sometimes permanently, sometimes for only a time. In this matrilocal tradition, the woman's family retained its land, its name, its rituals. The man adapted. His role was to join, not to conquer. This stood in contrast to many neighboring cultures where women were sent away. In Japan, at least for a time, the bride stayed rooted. Later, this practice gave way to yomiuri, where the bride moved to the groom's household. This shift reflected changing values as patriarchal norms slowly deepened. Yet even then, the transition was gentle. Marriage did not require a priest or a public declaration. It required mutual understanding, family approval, and the performance of specific rituals that whispered rather than shouted. The heart of a Shinto marriage was the act of sharing sake. In the Sansankyudo ceremony, the bride and groom would sip from 3 cups, each taken 3 times. 9 sips in total, not a toast, not a celebration, a binding. Each sip symbolized a layer of connection between the couple, between their families, and between their spirits. No vows were spoken. No witnesses demanded signatures. The ritual itself was the promise. Clothing mattered. Movements mattered. Silence mattered. The couple might say nothing at all, yet emerge from the ceremony more tightly joined than if they had spoken pages of vows. This was marriage in the Japanese tradition, restrained, sacred, unspoken. For the elite, alliances through marriage held political weight. For farmers and merchants, it meant the merging of labor and property. But always it meant continuity. Children ensured the survival not only of the name, but of the ancestral rights. Without heirs, ancestral altars grew cold. The spirits hungered. The home dimmed. Women in ancient Japan held more rights than in many neighboring cultures. They could inherit land, manage estates, and sometimes retain control of their own lineage. Power flowed through the matrilineal line in some regions. While patriarchy would eventually rise and reshape these freedoms, echoes of early balance remained. Polygamy was practiced among nobles, but it was not institutionalized. Divorce, too, was possible, quiet, discreet, handled with care for honor. A failed marriage did not shatter the community. It simply altered its shape. A separation required no court, only a recognition that the harmony had been lost. Harmony, above all, was the goal. A good marriage was like a well-kept garden, not always passionate but always tended. A space where two lives could grow quietly beside one another without overreaching. It did not demand constant attention, but it required respect, steady hands, an ear tuned to the rhythms of the other. And when it worked, it was beautiful, not grand, not dramatic, but lasting like stone beneath moss. In ancient Japan, marriage was not a stage. It was a step, not a performance, but a gesture, a way of saying, I will walk with you, not in front, not behind, but beside, through wind, through silence, through time. In the marble colonnades of ancient Rome, marriage was not the domain of poets, it was the business of the state. Here, the union of two people was not simply about affection or alliance. It was about order, property, citizenship, power. To marry in Rome was to accept a role in the grand architecture of society. It was civic, legal, strategic. There were two principal forms of marriage, and each spoke volumes about who held power in the relationship. The older form, cum manu, placed the wife entirely under her husband's authority, manus, the Roman hand of control. She left her father's home and entered the dominion of her husband or his patriarch. Legally, she became his daughter. Her dowry became his asset. Her decisions his to make. But as Roman society evolved, so too did the institution. Cum manu faded, replaced by sine manu without the hand. In this version, the woman remained under her father's authority, even after marriage. She retained legal identity, property, and power. For some elite women, this meant a kind of independence rare in the ancient world. The wedding itself was more than ritual, it was performance. The bride wore a flammeum, a veil the color of fire. Her hair was parted with a spear, a nod to Rome's martial origins. The ceremony included offerings to Juno, goddess of marriage, and to the household gods. Hands were joined in the dextrum iunctio, the symbolic clasping of right hands, a gesture of equality in a society that rarely practiced it. And then the procession. The bride was led to her new home, accompanied by torchlight, flute music, and the applause of family and friends. At the door, she smeared oil and wool on the threshold, symbols of domestic duty. She stepped inside, crossing into her new identity, wife, matron, Roman woman. But what of love? It existed, of course, in letters, in poetry, in stolen moments. But it was not required. Roman marriage was not for passion. It was for pietas, duty to family, ancestors, and the republic. A husband's role was to manage the household and preserve the family name. A wife's was to raise children, manage servants, and keep the domestic sphere in order. Yet women in Rome, especially those in sine manu marriages, could own land, run businesses, inherit wealth. They could even initiate divorce. And divorce in Rome was surprisingly casual. A marriage could be ended by simple declaration. No court, no priest, no lengthy argument. The couple, or more often the man, would declare the union over, and property would be divided according to the marriage agreement. Senators married for alliances. Emperors married for legitimacy. Love, if it arrived, had to find space between political strategy and household expectations. Still, the private sphere sometimes told a different story. Tomb inscriptions speak of couples who lived not just in shared duty but in affection. One reads, "She lived with me for 41 years without a single quarrel." Another, "To my dearest wife, whose absence is a wound no time can close." Marriage in Rome, then, was a contradiction, publicly rigid, privately diverse. A structure defined by law but filled with the unpredictable quiet of human hearts. It was empire and household, iron and olive oil, a hand extended in ritual and sometimes, unexpectedly, in tenderness. In the world of the ancient Hebrews, marriage was more than a private vow. It was a covenant, a sacred bond shaped by tradition, watched over by God and recorded not just in clay or parchment, but in the stories of a people. This was a culture where family meant survival, where identity flowed through bloodlines, and where the future of a tribe could be changed by a single union. To marry was not just to form a household, it was to protect inheritance, preserve faith, and ensure that God's commandments would continue through the next generation. The Torah, scripture, law, history all viewed marriage as essential. A man was expected to marry. It was not merely tradition, it was obedience. "Be fruitful and multiply," the ancient commandment said. Marriage was the vessel through which this command was fulfilled. A man without a wife was not complete, and a woman without children lived in the shadow of sorrow. Love was not the starting point. It may have followed, it may not. But the foundation was duty. Families arranged the match. Fathers negotiated. Mothers advised. And always the focus was on compatibility, not of personality, but of lineage, faith, and community standing. The union was designed to protect the purity of the people, to keep bloodlines intact, and to ensure that land passed to the right heirs. The groom paid a mohar, a bride price, not to purchase the woman, but to honor her family and signal serious intent. In return, a marriage contract, the ketubah, was drafted. This document listed the husband's responsibilities: food, clothing, shelter, and intimacy. It also protected the wife in case of divorce or widowhood, ensuring she would not be left destitute. Weddings were not lavish ceremonies. Often they were domestic, intimate, centered in the bride's home, but they were joyous. There was wine, singing, the presence of elders, and the reading of sacred texts. Blessings were spoken, not only over the couple but over the generations to come. And still, patriarchy defined the structure. A wife submitted to her husband's authority, yet within the home her wisdom held weight. Proverbs speak of the woman of valor, a wife who is industrious, compassionate, and praised at the gates. Her value was not only in childbirth, but in stewardship. Polygamy was practiced, especially by early patriarchs. Abraham had Sarah and Hagar. Jacob had Leah and Rachel. But even then, the stories are filled with tension, rivalries, grief. The text remembers not just the law, but the pain. Over time, monogamy grew more common, especially after exile and reform. Rabbis debated, clarified, and slowly reshaped the ideal. Marriage became not only a duty, but a partnership, still unequal, still structured, but more stable. Divorce was permitted but never taken lightly. A man could issue a get, a writ of divorce, but it required cause, consent, and witnesses. The process was carefully managed to ensure the woman's honor was preserved and that injustice did not stain the community. For the Hebrews, marriage echoed the covenant between God and Israel, a sacred relationship, a mutual responsibility, a promise not made lightly. To marry was to declare that life was not meant to be lived alone. That faith was carried not only through prayer, but through the raising of children, the keeping of homes, and the building of futures. And so, in desert tents, in mountain villages, in towns by the Jordan, two people stood side by side, not only for each other but for a people, for a God who watched, for a story still being written. In the lands of the Celts, where mist curled over stones older than memory and rivers carried the voices of gods, marriage was not bound by rigid law or doctrine. It was a living ritual, shaped by the turning of seasons, the needs of the tribe, and the deep-rooted belief that life was meant to flow, not to be caged. Across the rolling hills of Ireland, the highlands of Scotland, the forests of Gaul, marriage varied from clan to clan, but its purpose remained steady: to bind two people in kinship, to create alliance, to plant roots that would hold fast through winter and war. There were no grand temples, no imperial decrees. Instead, there were oaths spoken beneath open sky. Witnesses gathered not to judge but to honor. Elders and druids stood by as guardians of tradition, as guides of spirit. The land was sacred, and so too was the act of joining lives upon it. Marriage could take many forms. Monogamy was common, but among the noble and wealthy, polygyny was practiced. A man might have more than one wife, but each relationship carried weight. These were not casual additions, but negotiated bonds. Every wife held standing. Every household had its balance, and Celtic women were not passive. They could own property, lead clans, initiate divorce. A woman could walk away from a union that no longer served her or her people. She could remarry. She could govern. In some stories, queens ruled armies and households alike, strong in spirit, sharp in speech, and respected by gods and men. One of the most striking customs was the trial marriage, an agreement to live together for a year and a day. No legal traps, no eternal vows, just time, to test harmony, to see if love or at least compatibility would grow. If it did, the union became permanent. If not, they parted without shame. The bond was broken as it was formed honestly, without malice. Ceremonies often aligned with nature. The festival of Beltane, marking the beginning of summer, became a favored time for unions. Couples would leap together over flames, bonfires lit not for spectacle, but for purification. They joined hands as they crossed the firelight, pledging not just to each other, but to the rhythm of the seasons, to the turning of the wheel. Vows were simple, spoken from memory, shaped by the moment. And though few were ever written down, they echoed through generations. To love with honor, to protect what they built, to share harvest and hardship, to raise children not only in strength but in story. Marriage contracts existed, especially among the powerful. They included dowries, land, livestock. But even then, emotion had a place. A husband who abused or neglected his wife could be brought before tribal elders. A wife who betrayed trust could lose her standing. The union, though flexible, was not without accountability. Divorce, when it came, was often a matter of dignity. Shared property was divided. Children stayed with the parent best suited to guide them. There were no courts in the Roman sense, no judgments etched in stone, just elders, community, and the unspoken understanding that harmony was always the goal. To the Celts, marriage was not only about people, it was about place. A couple's love was a thread in the greater weave of land and tribe. Their union was not merely personal, it was ancestral, spiritual. A sacred act whispered into wind and carried into forests long after names were forgotten. There were no empires in these hills, No codified systems that tried to freeze love into doctrine, but there were stories, there were fires, there were vows beneath trees older than kingdoms, and there were two hands, joined not in conquest but in courage. In the end, Celtic marriage was this, not possession, not permanence, but promise. A promise made in the open air, beneath stars, above roots, between souls.